Buried next to me now is the last full-blooded leader of the Cherokee people, Chief Pathkiller, who died in 1827. And in order to set the stage for Pathkiller's story, I figured I ought to go into the history of European contact with the Cherokee Nation, which surprisingly in the early stages was not as violent and bloody as you might expect. Now, the story here begins with Sir Alexander Cumming, something of an eccentric oddball, who in fact was not on commission from European powers at all. In fact, his story is so complex and dramatic that it deserves its own video, but suffice it to say, he was a lawyer up in Scotland, he was scorned from his practice, and his wife had a vision that he would go and basically create a utopia in America with the Cherokee. So he arrives in the early 1700s to the colony of Carolina and makes a beeline directly for Tellico, which is the capital of the overland Cherokee. And in the span of less than 2 years, he crowns a man, the Moitoi of Tellico, which what that did for the Cherokee was it created one leader, a king, with whom negotiations could take place between the Cherokee and the British. Before this, the Cherokee were basically a confederation of different clans with many leaders. Now, Cumming came in and just said, "You're king now." And in turn, Cumming was actually created a chief of the people. And before 2 years had passed, he was back in the capital of the Carolinas with Cherokee chiefs surrounding him, subservient chiefs to the Moitoi of Tellico, and the British said, you know, even though we didn't commission you to do this, we view you as a very useful person. Now, of course, Sir Alexander Cumming began suggesting these wild ideas of relocating all of Europe's Jews to the Appalachian Mountains and establishing an alchemical system which would export gold from his mythical utopian kingdom and create a wealthy empire up in Central America. Now, of course, the British kind of stopped paying attention to him after this, and he died pretty penniless in Scotland. But what they did learn from Alexander Cumming was that the Cherokee were a matrilineal system, and that served European powers very well. Of course, in Europe, you gained your titles through the patriarchal line. You would come into positions of power because of your father. However, if you went and married a Cherokee woman, you married into the tribe. You gained all of her titles, you gained her land, and you gained the respect that her family had earned. And this started taking place throughout the 17 and 1800s. You had a lot of people who were mixed race coming into positions of authority, but not necessarily positions of power. You didn't have chiefs that were mixed until after Pathkiller. Now, around the years before the Revolutionary War, the Cherokee were very friendly with the British, thanks in no small part to Alexander Cumming, who opened up negotiations between them and the Empire. The British supplied them with rifles, and they were able to secure their borders against the Creek further to the south. And so, during the Revolution, they began fighting the Americans, because naturally this relationship with the British was now cut off, and the Americans viewed them as violent collaborators with the Crown. And even earlier than that, the British had established a policy that said whites could not move beyond the Appalachian Mountains. They couldn't go west of the ridge. But there were people who decided to actually pay the Cherokee to move into a place called Watauga. It was the Wataugan settlement, and early American historians kind of considered that the first independence movement to separate themselves from the Crown. In any case, they weren't anticipating the environmental destruction that these colonists would bring, and so Pathkiller, in his very early days, was active in the wars against those settlers, even before the British had left. Now that the British were gone, from 1790 to about 1803, he was active in fighting American expansionism. So one of the most popular stories to be told about him was that a troop of volunteers was captured in Kentucky, and these men were sentenced in front of Chief Pathkiller to death. However, Pathkiller's daughter actually fell in love with one of them, a man named Moore, and so in the middle of the night, before he was supposed to be burned at the stake alongside his comrades, she came and cut his binds and brought him a pony, and they kind of went off into the mountains. Now, Pathkiller's men executed the other American soldiers and went for days to go and search for these people. Meanwhile, snow had set in, and near starving because they couldn't create a fire, of course that would attract Pathkiller, they decided to slaughter their pony and eat it. Well, eventually they made their way to the safety of a white settlement, and news of Pathkiller began to spread. However, it seems that around this time he created a bit of a worse name for himself. Sevier, the first governor of Tennessee, literally went against the orders of President George Washington, who had requested Cherokee show up for a peace conference. And Sevier set out one of his captains to massacre these chiefs under the war crime of perfidy, flying a white flag and saying we want to talk, and then massacring the chiefs that were attending a peace conference. Well, after that point in time, Pathkiller and a number of other Cherokee and even Creek people, because by this point they were allied against the Americans and had a common enemy, they decided to go and invade the settlements up in southern Tennessee. Now, eventually Pathkiller would create a name for himself as a brutal warrior, as one of the last warrior leaders of the Cherokee, because he was involved with this ill-fated expedition. They went up to southern Tennessee, and the initial plan was to burn down the settlement and send them on their merry way back up over the Appalachia. We don't know what side Pathkiller was on in this conflict, but one of the chiefs and his band suggested scalping, torturing, and killing all of the men, women, and children included. And we don't know which side Pathkiller was on. We think that he probably joined Morgan's regiment of the Tennessee Militia sometime around the War of 1812, because the Tennessee Militia, being a backwoods militia, was not active in fighting the British. They were in the backwoods, and they took part in the War of 1813 between the Creek tribe. And at this point in time, Pathkiller may have actually been enlisted as a colonel under Andrew Jackson, fighting against his old enemies, the Creek. Now, this is kind of hotly debated. We don't know if Pathkiller took part in this. In any case, by the early 1800s, European powers were really moving in and beginning to mix with the Cherokee. Now, they viewed this as mutually beneficial. The Cherokee said, we have good relationships with you now, we still follow our matrilineal lines, and you can follow your patriarchal lines. However, Pathkiller was the last person to have that pure bloodline and was the last warrior chief. So upon his death in 1827, his brother took the position of chief, but that only lasted for about 2 weeks, and he was also mixed race, and then another chief came into play, and from this point in time, this was the late 1820s. By the 1830s, roughly 2/3 of the Cherokee Nation were mixed race, and by mid-1830s, they were relocated, thanks in part to mixed-race families like the Waddy family and the Hicks family, and you can't necessarily blame them for signing the relocation documents, because they were genuinely under the impression that if they did not, they would be totally wiped out. And what's fascinating here is that we know very little about Chief Pathkiller. We know he was the last full-blooded leader. We know that he was referred to in contemporary sources as a king of the Cherokee, the people under him being referred to as chiefs, although now we would consider him more or less a head chief, but we don't really know his military exploits, because as far as I can tell, he never really left anything written down, and all accounts of him were written by people like Moore, who was saved by his daughter.